Good afternoon, everyone. And though this lecture is being delivered a little bit later, I'm sure you are all happy that we had Professor Shastri before us, and that we had a very interesting intervention of what may happen in April, May of the coming months. I'm going to take you somewhere else, and I hope you will be with me in this different kind of intervention that is being done now. A few months back, when I met Dr. Sathe, the HOD of RCWS, she reminded me of an article that I'd written more than 3 decades back on Gandhi and his ideas of women, and indicated to me how it remains important even now on the discussions regarding women and nationalism, and more generally on a way to perceive the women's question in India. It was titled The Construction and Reconstruction of Women in India, and was first published in the EPW in February 1988, 31 years back. This is February 2019. Since then, it has been republished many times, both in its English original and in other languages, both in India and outside India, in translation, and also in various anthologies that debate Gandhi and the women's question in India. It has also provoked many critical comments, and in fact very negative comments, from feminists and Gandhian scholars, and yet remains a prescribed text for some women's studies curriculum today. Thus, when Dr. Sathe invited me to give this year's Amabai Memorial Lecture, I thought it was most appropriate to revisit this paper and this theme, particularly given that the issues that Amabai Wadia raised, especially regarding family planning, were inimical to Gandhi. And I am going to speak issues which are going to be inimical to Gandhians who believe that Gandhi discussed very radical issues regarding women. Also, I have used the archive for which RCWS has received grants from Amabai Memorial Trust. I am therefore very grateful to Dr. Sathe and Professor Guru, who is chairing this session, for allowing me to give this lecture, but also visiting this university where I worked and I stayed up there in the hostel. So thank you very much. And Professor Margaret, it's so kind of you to be present here, because I met you then in SNDT years back. And it is wonderful to have you here to be present in this lecture. There are 2 objectives to this presentation. While outlining the main ideas on Gandhi on women and elaborating on the questions that led me to interpret Gandhian ideas on women in a particular way, I'll also be discussing the theories and methodologies that I've used to make this assessment. Pierre Bourdieu has alerted us to the biases that structure our work as researchers and the necessity to use a reflexive stance. Thus, in order to understand the criticisms that this paper has generated, I think it's important to lay bare the practices through which the arguments were constituted. Though the paper does not discuss the Gandhi's involvement in the workers' struggle in Ahmedabad textile industry, I would like to suggest that my perspective on Gandhi's ideas on women developed due to an assessment of his role in this struggle. This assessment was based on hints and cues given to me in the long interviews, now called my feminist life narratives, that I conducted with workers, both women and men, left and mainstream trade unionists and mill owners in Ahmedabad. These interviews, together one with Ila Bhatt, that is Ila Ben of Seva, and an assessment of the current plight of women workers, provided me with a critical perspective that comprehends the limitations of trade unionism, of the nationalist movement, and the Gandhian ideology. This critical perspective was further augmented with conversations with my mother, Leela Ben Patel, who was involved in various ways in the nationalist movement since she was 8 years of age, and who remained active in it until she left the Congress party in 1948 because of Gandhi's call to disband the party. At that time, she was second in charge under S.K. Patil of BPCC, Bombay Pradesh Congress Committee. Her views and interpretations, and also that of her colleagues and friends on the activities of which women as against men were involved in, the division of labor in the party, and its use in the way protests were organized and planned, and the uneasiness about the dress code, the white khaki sari, helped me to refine many of my arguments. The second objective of this presentation is to converse with the criticism made on my paper on Gandhi, and as well ask whether I hold the same position today, as I did 3 decades back. While I will argue I have not changed my position, I also want to contend that if I was writing this article today, I would not limit its critical edge to merely documenting and interpreting Gandhian ideas on women, but to perceive his notions, his ideas and practices as being part of Gandhi's general position on masculinity. Masculinities are about creating a gender order through an organization of ideas, dispositions and practices about the male and the female. During early modernity in countries such as France and England, there was more generally there was explicit discussion on the male body, male clothes, male demeanor, and more generally on what we know as masculinity. Such discussions were rare to find in India in early 20th century, except when males were debating issues such as sexual science, the Victorian ideology that affirms subordination of women. This is also true of Gandhi. He does not discuss masculinity, but his anxiety about masculinity comes to the forefront when he discusses the male need for sex, or when he propagates sex for procreation and advocates celibacy in marriage and rejects sexual needs and sensuality of women. In these discussions, his personal problems with his own sexuality merges with his political assessments of the future of the Indian nation and the role women can play in it. The absence of an open discussion on the masculinities in Gandhi's writings is compensated by an unequivocal and a clear deliberation of the Indian women in context to the husband's control over her sexuality and her sensualities. I have suggested that the Gandhian notion of masculinity revolves around the sexual needs of the Indian husband and the control that they need to exercise over women in the household as patriarchs. Thus, by articulating where women should be, the roles they need to play as wives and mothers, I would contend that he elaborated the nature of Indian masculinity in the context of nationalism as he attempted to create a model of hegemonic masculinity. In my earlier paper and now, I've deconstructed his writings on women on topics such as what knowledge women need to have, how they need to behave and organize their lives in the private and public domains, and analyze these as they have evolved in time since the 1910s to around 1940. Gandhi, I will argue, was articulating a gendered order and a space that women and men need to occupy in the new India of his imagination. For women, this space was that of subservience. I have and will argue that women in India need to reject it, and thereby reject Gandhian ideas on women. I joined the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library at Tirumurti for a fellowship in early 1985 after completing my doctorate on capital labor relationship in Ahmedabad textile industry. Professor Leela Dubey, Leela ji, one of the members of the committee committee on women's committee that I think there's something wrong with it.
You want to say something? Then
I think this may be better. Yeah. So, Professor Leela Dubey, who was one of the members of the committee that ultimately wrote the report on the women's situation in 1974, who was a senior fellow and my colleague at Tirumurti, she came to know of my work and asked whether I would like to give a paper on Gandhi and working class women in Ahmedabad textile industry. At the next conference of Indian Association of Women's Studies to be held in Chandigarh in 1986. The IAWS has been established in 1982 after a highly successful first conference in 1981 at SNTT here, and had set itself various programs to create knowledge on and of women in India. In its second conference in Trivandrum in 1984, there was a very animated discussion because the Sri Shakti Sangadhana, which was involved in trying to understand the women's role in Telangana movement, had presented their paper, which later came out in Telugu in 1986 and in English in 1989 as a book called We Were Making History, Life Stories of Women in Telangana People's Struggles. This presentation had evoked strong criticisms from the left, which was ruling it there at Trivandrum, and because of the highly disparaging remarks on it and the role that the CPM had played in understanding the role of the women's question in the movement. At this conference, IAWS created a task force to document and discuss various ways in which women participated in political struggles and protests. The task force acknowledged that there was very little information and analysis on women's role in the past and present, and decided to have, at the Chandigarh conference in 1986, the third one, to discuss this matter. And there, they had a special session on women and the nationalist movement. This was chaired by Professor Veena Majumdar, who was the chair of the 1974 committee, and they asked me to present my paper at this session. I would like to admit that this paper evoked, at best, a lukewarm response from the chair and the audience. It led me to ask the question, what did I argue that did not sit well with this audience? In order to answer this question, let me briefly narrate the main arguments what the paper presented. I discussed in this paper the key arguments of my research on capital-labor relationship on Ahmedabad textile industry, and I suggested that Gandhi, who had set up the Textile Labor Association and who had led the workers' movement, had convinced both workers and mill owners not to strike and not to have lockouts, and that all manners of negotiation would decide how wages, worker security, and job security was to be handled. He also created an institutional structure for the cooperation between the workers and the capital. In this thesis, I discussed the evolution of this institutional structure, which I later called corporatism, on the basis of the political scientist Philip Schmitter's work on the US AFL-CIO trade union movement, and it documented in this work, there was a documentation how the nationalist movement in Ahmedabad acted as a trust creating mechanism between these two groups, between mill owners and workers, and that ultimately, if what happened in Ahmedabad was that these negotiations led to these antagonist groups accepting the collective fight against colonialism. As a consequence, the position encouraged the marginalization of militant and left organizations, I concluded, and their cultures in Ahmedabad, and had a major impact in promoting conservative orthodoxies and forming Gujarat as a righteous society, the implication of which we see today. I also argued that though the workers benefited by obtaining higher wages and housing and other social security assistance, this was not so when the industry went into the economic crisis. In mid-1930, the textile industry in Ahmedabad faced competition from Japan. In 1935, under pressure from mill owners and in the context of obtaining limited provincial autonomy through the Government of India Act of 1935, where he needed the mill owners' support, Gandhi negotiated an agreement wherein, in lieu of a family wage, which we call today's DA, he agreed that wives and I want you to understand this. He agreed that wives of male workers would resign from the textile industry voluntarily. By 1936, the number of women workers employed in the textile industry in Ahmedabad had reduced drastically. The displacement had also had a caste dimension, given that a large number of women workers were from the Wankar community, a Dalit group of weavers associated with Ahmedabad's pre-modern handloom industry. They were displaced earlier from being weavers when the modern textile industry was established in the mid-19th century. And as more and more mills were set up, they were recruited in the spinning department, though they were skilled as weavers. And where the weavers were recruited from the upper caste. Because, as we know, there was use of spit to thread the needle in case of the thread having broken. Now, they were displaced again because of Gandhi as a consequence of the Gandhi-Bellona agreement. I quoted many speeches of Gandhi which suggested that wives and children should not be working. What should they be doing? That, and I quote Gandhi here, they should not go to work at the cost of education for the sake of extra income of 3 or 4 rupees. Work is not for women in factories. They have plenty of work to do at home. They should attend to bringing up their children. They must give peace to the husband when he returns tired, minister to him, soothe him if he is angry, and do any work they can by staying at home. It is not for our women to go out and work as men do. If we send them to factories, who will look after our domestic and social affairs? The last part of my paper dealt with this current situation. While giving details of everyday lives of Wankar women, the Dalit Wankar women who are now contract workers, who were displaced, I look at what was the situation today. The situation today was the following, and this was informed to me because Ilaben was handling this matter in the Textile Labour Association, where she was a labour lawyer. She told me that while the women workers were displaced in 1930s, and there was hardly any permanent women workers there in the textile industry, she found that all of a sudden, since the early 1970s, they were re-employed as contract workers. So she asked me to do a survey on these contract workers, and this survey report was published in EPWA in October 1986. And when I found out that the present, that is in the early 1980s, these contract workers, who were women, who were from the Wankar caste, were really daughters of those who have been displaced in 1935. So as a consequence, I did long conversations, which are called life narratives, with the mothers of these women workers who were still alive. And it discussed their memories of their work lives and the organization of their home lives. And I found, to my amazement, that after being displaced, they became informal workers and doing home-based work after being displaced from their, and voluntarily resigning because Gandhi asked them to do it. And I go ahead and talk about various ways in which they talked about the problems that that was affecting them today. Though I probed a lot, they did not accept that Gandhi or TLA were part of the problem. And it made me, these long interviews gave me enough understanding of how contemporary processes of industrialization had made women's lives impoverished and marginalized. Modernity is supposed to be freedom, mobility, and expansion of opportunities to individuals. But instead, it seemed to me that almost everyone, Millonas, Gandhi, and TLA, had acted to disempower women workers. Surely this experience should be the basis of understanding Gandhi's ideas on women. As mentioned above, this paper, when presented in Chandigarh, received a lukewarm response. While no one doubted the facts, many could not accept the conclusions, and I wondered why. So I asked myself whether I had gone wrong somewhere, and if so, why had I made mistakes? Coincidentally, just then, around the middle of 1986, I received a call from my mother, who was extremely annoyed with the questions asked by the team members of the Oral History Group, who was recording the experiences of women who had participated in the national movement. This project, sponsored by the Indian Council of Historical Research, was being conducted by a group of historians led by Professor Bipin Chandra, who was also my co-supervisor, incidentally. She informed me that she and other friends were asked to answer questions regarding Gandhi and their relationship to his ideas. She was quite surprised that the historians were not interested in knowing how she and the others had become involved in various ways in different activities of the movement. They were also not keen to understand the diverse roles that they had performed in the movement. Questions such as, when did you first see Gandhi and in what circumstances? What was the nature of interaction with him? Which ideas on Gandhi, on women, had motivated them to align themselves with the national movement, and so on were asked. She was annoyed because Gandhi had nothing to do with her becoming involved in any of the activities of the movement. Nor was she sure of the specific ideas of Gandhi on women which motivated her. So I asked her to tell her own story in the way she wanted, and when she did, I realized there were many different ways young girls and older women had become part of the nationalist movement. In her case, it was her mother and her brother who would take the family to listen to speeches at Chowpatty. Later, she became involved when she and her friends lived in an area and were asked to distribute pamphlets. One day, early in the morning, she heard people passing by singing bhajans in the street, and because she enjoyed singing the same bhajans, she became from then on part of the Prabhat fairies that were taking place in that area. And much later, she became part of the group of young women who used to roll chapatis for volunteers and activists, mostly men. Where was, she asked me, Gandhi in all this? This question made me realize that by late 70s and early 80s, a dominant narrative had been put in place by women studies scholars and historians regarding Gandhi and women. They believed that the physical public presence of women in the national movement would not have been possible without Gandhi's encouragement, support, and backing. They also argued that Gandhian ideas on women continued with the reformist tradition of the late 19th century and reconstituted these in new ways. Not only did he question, according to them, the practices relating to child marriage, dowry, and sati, together with other Brahminical practices such as Parta, but he promoted in a modern way the rights of women and encouraged their emancipation, drawing them in active participation in politics. It was presumed by various scholars that mere participation in any activity of the movement is necessarily the first step of empowerment without realizing what was the content of that participation. Various texts, such as those written by Sri Devi, the one edited by B.R. Nanda, where Veena Majumdar herself had elaborated on Gandhian ideas on womanhood, as well as other commentaries by Geraldine Forbes, Karuna Ahmed, Devki Jain, and Madhukishwar attest to this position. Devki Jain, in fact, was the first scholar to promote the idea that there was a Gandhian feminism, when she argued that it is possible to draw out Gandhian feminist ethics from his writings. And of course, the clearest elaboration of this point of view was by Veena Majumdar, who said that Gandhi's revolutionary approach allowed this approach as equal to the feminist movement. And she concludes that this is a movement all across the world, that is the feminist movement, and Gandhi is one of the leaders of this feminist movement. Both of them, she argues, propagate equality in the family and society, dignity of women's personality, the opening up of wider opportunities for women for her self-development, and refusal to be regarded as sex symbols. And then, in a book published by published in London, but of a project that SNDT RCWS had sponsored. Anu Dastur and Usha Mehta says, when Mahatma Gandhi came to India after his long sojourn in South Africa, the ground of women's emancipation was prepared. Sensitive to impose dignity, conscious of worth of men and women, he devoted and wove women's needs in the fabric of to the fight for freedom. And women could not have wished for a better champion. So, I asked myself, why is it that these group of women and these group of thinkers, including historians, suggest, as Veena Majumdar has put it, Gandhi facilitated the acceptance of women's cause by the nationalists, particularly in the public life. This, I came to realize that this assumption was guided by the interpretations and commentaries on him. As a result, an attempt has been made by the researchers to look for the liberationist aspect inherent in his ideology, and that these were not necessarily so. My mother's and her friends' annoyance with the questions on Gandhi made me realize there needs to be a separation between Gandhi's ideas on women and the way women had or not engaged with them. These two are separate research questions. Participation of any group of people in any political activity cannot simply be understood in terms of the way in which a charismatic leader may have articulated and mapped out his or her ideas. Because participation deals with actions, it is necessary to understand the context in which the actor constitutes an action. In the case of women and the national movement, equal, if not primary importance has to be given to the role played by caste associations, the family, the school, the college, the peer group, and the elders, especially the mother. And to make a comprehensive study of such participation, it is important not only to examine the way in which categories like class, caste, and region operate to differentially integrate individuals into movements, but also to analyze the mediatory roles played by local and regional political leaders. At best, ideas can create a climate of action. The action itself is determined by other factors, not necessarily only these ideas. And it's almost similar to what Professor Shastri just said. In case of women and their participation in the national movement, to reduce the Gandhian ideology to this purpose is both to dehistoricize a leader of the capacity of Gandhi and to suggest that and to trivialize the context in which the momentous steps have been taken by individuals within these movements. It was clear to me that Gandhian ideas should not be seen in terms of how ordinary women engage with them, but rather on their own terms, as a discursive space. But there are two other issues that emerge out of the conversation with my mother and her friends which are significant. The first was the fact that activities of the Congress Party was gendered. And it's important to understand because all parties have this gendering within themselves. Distributing pamphlets, making chapatis were women's job, and they were mobilized to do the same. Thus, there was gender division of activities in the party, but also in the movement. But more significant was the dress code designed for women, the white khadi sari, indicating women's purity. I heard many disparaging remarks on this theme. One person that I interviewed asked me, why is it that we are made to mourn our involvement in national struggles by wearing white? Do remember, white is there when you go for death functions. Why can I not wear red, she asked. Was not my involvement related to my freedom? Why was this taken away from me? I learned that after independence, whenever she attended the Congress Party meetings, she wore bright red saris. Just then, I happened to see two films by Girish Kesarwali based on U.R. Anandmurthy's books, Sanskar and Gata Shraddha, both evoking the problems faced by Brahmin women and Brahmin widows, with hair tonsured and in white clothes, with no blouse, who were made to live on the edges of village society. I thought, is this what Gandhi wanted women to become when they were active in politics? The denial of sensuality and sex, family life, and intimate sociabilities seems to be Gandhi's ideas of how women can be in the public life. I want to now go on what is Gandhi's hegemonic masculinity, and before I do that, I just want to reaffirm that what I say about Gandhi's ideas on women need not be thought as the way women acted and became part, for the reasons for what they became part of. When they really became part, they did what they wanted. They didn't do what Gandhi wanted of them. But Gandhi did intervene to ensure that his immediate family members and his immediate party members did what he wanted to do. And the first thing came out very clearly when Gandhi was asked by few women prostitutes that they wanted to become, when they heard their speech, they wanted to become members of the Congress party. Gandhi first said yes. And then he wrote a long letter saying that Congress party is a pure organization and they cannot have impure women in the party. So the Charana membership was withdrawn from these women. The second element that happened was when the Bengal leader, Pal, his wife and daughters were arrested in the 1922-21 non-cooperation movement. And Gandhi wrote a long letter to them saying that he understood that they are facing dread of being raped because they were in the prison. Why he thought so, no one knows. But he thought that would be there, so he asked them to be prepared to take their life if such things happen. And the third event took place during the Dandi March, when he told Kasturba that he doesn't want her to be part of the Gandhi March. You look at all pictures, there's no Kasturba over there. And none of the women who is close to him in the ashram is also there. Why? Because this was a march where he thought again that they will remain unprotected by the males and there might be assaults on them. So as a consequence, he stopped them from being part of it and said that go to do anti-liquor movement, but don't come on the Dandi March. The only person who questioned him was Sarojini Naidu, and you'll see her pictures on all the days of the Dandi March, and even in the picture called Gandhi, she's present in the Dandi March. So it occurred to me that his model of hegemonic masculinity draws its elements from a particular context. In Gandhi, it was drawn from a space inhabited by the urbanized middle-class, upper-caste Hindu male's perception of what a woman should be. In a significant way, there is a sense of continuity in Gandhian ideas on women and those formulated by the reformers. Though Gandhi introduced a dynamic concept that of politics in this model of social role for women, he did not revolutionize the assumptions on which these middle-class reformers perceived women. In Gandhi, politics was redefined to find a space in the home. The reformers of 19th century believed in the doctrine of the separate spheres, whose roots were in biology. And that's why I said Gandhi's ideas come from the Victorian notion of sexual science. And there's a lot of work now recently been done on the theory of the sexual science and its implication on the conception of human masculinity. And there are two new books that have just recently come out on this. The differences between sexes was explained in terms of, quote, natural differences, which legitimize different social and cultural roles of men and women in society, and whose basis moral prescriptions underlining their behaviors and interaction with each other were built. Marriage was a social institution in which these two spheres got articulated. The male was the breadwinner, the provider, the protector, and the superior. Women was the mother, nurturer, the giver, and the inferior. There was a slight variation in the various forms of this ideology articulated itself. Sometimes male could be selfish or independent or possessive, yet lacking in intuition and strength. The woman, on the other hand, was thought to be selfless, patient, dependent, full of courage and humility. We see this running as a leitmotif in Gandhi's ideology of women. These 19th century's idea of the home were preserved in the traditional division of society and prepared the future generations' entrance into the new world. One of the various forms in which patriarchy created itself through the formulation of a morally superior ideal woman who was the embodiment of all the best and goodness of human life in the world, the conscience of the maid and society. Gandhi not only accepted these assumptions, but he extended them to fit his own perspective relating to participation of women in politics. The introduction of spinning wheel, and this is something I must tell you, I got it from the interviews that I did with women workers who asked me, why did Gandhi think that we should do spinning? So I said, what's wrong with that? And she said, but that keeps me in the house. How will I go out? And this is it. The introduction of spinning wheel as a political symbol becomes an instrument in the woman in the home to participate in political life from within the house, not from outside. The morally superior woman of the home, created by the reformists, was now given another attribute via the spinning wheel. In Gandhi, the spinning of khadi was turned into a political message which was reposed onto the morally superior woman, who in turn became the symbol and the conscience of nation in the making. The woman as mother, who had innate natural capacities for wiseness, strength, courage, patience and intuition, now becomes the symbol of the new political message and a strategy of non-violence. Only then, only her involvement could free the nation from the clutches of the colonial power, according to Gandhi. So, he extracts, I argue, and extends the urban middle class image of women to reformulate it as a design for the new woman of India. He also reconstructs in the process her space in the house. He gives more power to her within the house and a legitimate space. And there are speeches and letters that Gandhi writes saying what women should do and how they should become educated. And one of the things he says is that they should learn accountancy because they have to do household incomes. And incidentally, I would like you to compare this with the curriculum of SNDT in the 1940s and 50s. You will find enormous parallels. He instructs the new model of women extracted from the received image of Hindu women living in the periphery of the society and added a new dimension to it, that of charity and social welfare. And thereby he builds a new model of women dedicated to the service of the nation. However, he asks himself, how can she be protected on the matter of sex? And then he finds that, and this is a question he asks after 1930s when women's participation in the movement has increased double-fold or treble-fold. So with more and more visible women's participation, how does Gandhi feels that he has to do something to protect them from any kind of sexual assaults that may come on their way if they become part of the family, part of the public life. So Gandhi then creates a new model of a woman over here, and that's my last argument. He constructs a morally superior woman who denies all sensuality and procreation, and wears white color, shows herself as a pure person, as a superior person, and desexed and desensual, who has to sacrifice the reproductive aspects of family life and has dedicated herself to the service of the nation. One of the most important images of that time, and you may be familiar with that in photographs, is that of Mridula Sarabhai wearing white khadi and becoming part of one of those Ahmedabad women leaders who ultimately becomes Gandhi's, very close to Gandhi and to the Congress Party. And of course, she's very important in the whole question of the partition issues and protecting women in the partition matter. The paper thus argues, and I'll try to finish up because Professor Guru has to go. The paper thus argues that Gandhian ideology assumes the following about women when it formulates the model of hegemonic masculinity. Men and women have distinct qualities whose roots are biological. Both of them have separate spheres in society and specific roles in the making of the Indian nation for their essentially complementary to each other. 2. Women are not playthings but creative individuals who have specific space for the construction of this creativity. This is mainly in the area of household and the domestic space. They play important roles as mothers and wives. 3. In the domestic space, that is, as wife and mother, women manifest feminine qualities and unsurpassable and somewhat superior to the masculine. These are self-reliance, courage, patience, purity, and a capacity to undergo suffering. To be able to be a good mother, a woman has to be given different education, which gives her a training not only on basic domestic needs, home science for instance, but also home economics and basic information about the world in which she is living. 5. Existing Hindu social customs do not allow women to grow into this new role. Therefore, child marriage, sati, dowry, which exploit women and reduce their dignity, has to be questioned. Women's organization should be formed only to question these and social evils, but also to build awareness of women in our role as mother and wife in new free India. 7. The most distinct and precious quality of women is her purity. To retain this purity, she should not do economic work. By doing economic work, her purity and honor is violated. Men and women have political rights, that is the right to vote. Women also have important role in politics as mother. She instills national consciousness in the children and participates in these programs. However, it's important that separate and different programs that involve women in participation be evolved. During the non-cooperation movement, spinning had become a separate program for women, and in the civil disobedience movement, picketing of liquor and foreign cloth shops was introduced to become special women's programs. 9. If she is forced to enter the public sphere, where she is not honored and not respected, and her purity is violated, she has to kill herself through sheer will force. Marriage, that is suicide. Marriage is only for reproduction. Sex without reproduction is abnormal. A woman can achieve higher moral and spiritual growth only if she rejects her sensuality, her sensuousness, her right to reproduce, her family life, and devotes herself to the welfare of the people. I would like to conclude with two points. First, I think it's important that we see our leaders as people of their times. Gandhi incorporated many ideas and attitudes related to his early socialization as a child from a Baniya caste in Saurashtra in his assessment of the country that he was trying to make into a nation state. Though he made various attempts to free himself from what he assimilated in his early childhood, he was not ever completely liberated from these dispositions, and nor are others. This was particularly true in the case of his vision of masculinity and that of women and their position in society. His understanding of this situation had resonance with many male social reformers, and I give the example of Karve in the case of SNDT. This year, when it's the 105th anniversary of Gandhi, we must remember that there is a new controversy about him. This is related to his racist positions as articulated in South Africa. The anger against him has led the Gandhian authorities to take down his statue, and a similar situation may occur in Malawi. Thus today, we see Gandhi being criticized not only for his assessment of class, caste, and gender, but also on race. In a context when in his is appropriated by the present government, which has embraced him as their new icon and made him the symbol of Swachh Bharat mission, in spite of having a negative relationship with Gandhi. We also see him being used in films like Munna Bhai and plays and in social movements and protests, both positively and negatively. It is thus important for feminists and scholars of women's studies to ensure that they do not become part of the popular consciousness that is there of our leaders such as Gandhi, and try to understand him and other leaders as a social scientist. My own critical edge with Gandhi emerged when I engaged with social theory. The latter gave me the tools to query methods and methodologies, as well as the epistemic bias organizing any study or a research program. This is also the legacy of the original feminism and women's studies. In these days of fake news and shrinking public's discussion of all matters, we need to reassert a critical perspective to do research and to engage with ideas through a reflexive intervention. I hope this paper will help us to lead to ensure these such deliberations. Thank you.